I'm Max Keiser. Welcome back to On the Edge. Time now to go to San Francisco and talk with Catherine Austin Fitts of Solari.com. Catherine served as Assistant Secretary of Housing in the George H.W. Bush administration. Catherine Austin Fitts, welcome back to On the Edge.
Hi, Max. It's great to be back. How are you doing?
Well, we're hanging in there. Now, let me ask you something. Let's talk about housing and fraud. First, take us back to the beginning of the mortgage fraud bubble. When did the systemic fraud in the mortgage sector begin? And how did it begin? Exactly what were the machinations of this?
Well, I hate to say this, Max, but I trace it back to the National Security Act and the beginning of the black budget, because if you look at the kind of fraud that's been going on in the United States, you know, it's been happening steadily for years, and it almost broke the bank in the 80s, and then we came back and did it again in the 90s. We have a mortgage system in the United States where there's significant federal guarantee and indirect guarantee through the FDIC system. About 70 to 80% of the mortgages, depending on how you count it, are backed directly or indirectly by the federal credit. And as that's happened, we've introduced at the federal level what I believe is very, very significant collateral fraud. And I think one of the reasons you're not seeing resolutions in the United States that allow the market to clear is because that collateral fraud is so extensive. It's requiring enormous amounts of intervention. To just give you some numbers, at the time of the bailouts, we had $12 trillion of bailouts, but $8 trillion at that time would have paid off 100% of the residential mortgages in the country. It would have also paid, the outstanding state debt at the time was $4 trillion. So that $12 trillion would have paid off all state and local government debt as well as all residential mortgages. So, you know, that hints at the extent of the collateral fraud.
Okay, let's go back to that 2008 period. Obama just walks into the White House. He's faced with a huge financial crisis, and he's got a choice to make. Either he bails out the creditors, that is to say the banks, or he bails out the borrowers, that is to say the debtors or the homeowners. Now, based on your numbers, it sounds like the right choice would have been to bail out the mortgage holders and let the banks fail and to take a completely different approach. But am I correct in saying that the problem Obama had at that time is that the banks and those people representing the banks, the Tim Geithner, Paul Volcker, et cetera, they did not fully disclose to Obama the extent of the bank's liabilities. In other words, if they told Obama honestly, you know what, we're sitting on $12 to $20 trillion in debt, undisclosed, non-disclosed, he could have made a better decision. But they basically lied to him, correct?
I think what you needed was a reset. And the problem that the president had in that situation was the only way you can do a reset is to have a global reset. Because if you look at the derivatives that were bailed out and the debt that was bailed out, it was global debt. So you literally had creditors all around the world who were depending on the U.S. central bank to keep the liquidity floating. And if you didn't, you weren't just going to have a financial crisis here in America, but you were going to have a global one. So I think we had sold trillions of dollars of fraudulent paper, including the collateral fraud, all around the world, and it was really an issue of national security. Were we going to make good on that paper or not? So you were looking at a national security issue and an issue of how you're going to manage the reserve currency. So it was a global political situation. It was not just domestic.
But this collateral fraud issue has only gotten worse because the money that was used to bail out the banks, they didn't use this in any constructive manner. They simply use it to make more speculative bets that are going bust in this current downturn. How is that a good policy? I mean, it's ridiculous.
Well, it makes no sense. The thing to do when you have a problem is to face it and deal with it. And the question we didn't ask then, the question we haven't dealt with and we're not dealing with now, which is, where has all this money been going? So between fiscal 1998 and fiscal 2002 in the United States, we saw over $4 trillion disappear. Where's that money going? Now, my theory is that, or my conjecture is that a lot of it's been going in the black budget. So I think, you know, when you and I talk about financial policy, whether it's domestic to the United States or global, we're not looking at a full picture, which is trillions of dollars is being siphoned off and being invested in going someplace. Where is it?
Well, we can talk about the black budget in a second, but clearly corporations have been reporting record profits, and they're sitting on record cash positions. Companies like General Electric and General Motors, they're not private companies. They're government-sponsored companies. These are not exposed to any risk as we know it. They're government entities, and they have received all this money from the government and the taxpayer, as you would find in any corrupt kleptocracy. That's where most of the money has gone. Isn't that true?
Well, no, I would say a great deal of money has gone. If you break down the government budget in this country, in the United States, and you break it down, Max, on a county by county level, because America just breaks down to 3,100 counties. And if you do a sources and uses of government flows by place, by county, what you'll discover is that very significant amounts of money are going into things which are not economically productive, both at the household level and at the corporate level. And what we've been watching is enormous subsidies flowing to prop up companies and corporations. So we've centralized the economy. We've used government money to do it. It's produced a very expensive, unproductive infrastructure. But if you dig in and you look at those financial flows, there is still on top of that an incredible amount of money that's literally disappearing, and I don't know whether it's disappearing into private endowments or it's disappearing into space programs or private armies or black budget technology, but it's very, very significant.
All right, let's get back to this term black budget that you've mentioned. Can you expand on that a bit?
The National Security Law Act was passed right after World War II, the end of World War II, and then we passed the CIA Act. And those two acts in combination gave the intelligence agencies the ability to claw money out of the budget from other agencies. So we created a mechanism that is outside of the United States Constitution. In other words, the government is borrowing money. It is giving that money to private corporations to do the most advanced technology and sort of secretive projects. And that's been going on for decades. And if you look at the Constitution of the United States says that we may not expend money that has not been appropriated by Congress. And in that process, there's supposed to be transparency, if not to the public, on very secretive projects, certainly to select committees of Congress. Now, I was part of a group of people in the Bush administration who were able to pass laws requiring the federal government to publish audited financial statements. That started that requirement kicked in 1995. To date, Max, the United States government has never once produced audited financial statements, which, as far as I'm concerned, says the entire spending process at this point is completely outside of the Constitution. And, one of the things I would love to see is for the average person to realize, look, as a citizen, we have an obligation to insist that the money be spent according to the law. And at this point, the entire government operation is outside the law. And I suspect part of it is because the demands of the black budget at this point are so significant. And it wouldn't surprise me if a lot of the collateral fraud went for those purposes.
All right, let's focus on this term collateral fraud, because you've mentioned it a couple of times. The black budget, I understand you're saying that since the National Security Act that was passed after World War II, the agencies like the CIA and others have unlimited spending authority with unlimited amounts of money to wage unlimited rogue wars around the world. Now, when you're talking about collateral value, I mean, this is a pretty straightforward banking term, but how does this play out in your picture that you're painting here of a rogue government driven by corrupt inside intelligence agencies who are bent on stealing the technology to commit illegal war acts?
Well, what I discovered, I served as Assistant Secretary of Housing in the first Bush administration, and then my company several years later was hired back on competitive bid to serve as the lead financial advisor and portfolio strategist for the Federal Housing Administration. And what we discovered, Max, at the time were just patterns of systemic fraud that were inexplicable. So, for example, when I was Assistant Secretary of Housing, I found one portfolio. It was a $9 billion portfolio. It's called coinsurance that had a 50% default rate and a 50% loss rate. I mean, it was just, it was impossible to explain by any rational a housing bubble or markets being down. You could only explain these patterns with systemic fraud. And one of the things we would find are communities where literally a house would default 5 times in a year. Well, that's, an enormous speed and trajectory. And so, to make a long story short, I think what was happening was literally you were taking houses, and instead of issuing one mortgage on them, you were issuing 10 mortgages. And as long as it was sitting in a government guaranteed securitized pool through Ginnie Mae, and I suspect this may have been what was happening in Fannie and Freddie, you could literally take one mortgage and end up through the securitized pools, instead of getting $100,000 for that mortgage, get $1 million. So I think one of the problems in letting the market clear is that there may be more than one mortgage on a lot of houses. And one of the reasons you're seeing real, frustration with people demanding to see the note and not being able to get the note is the reason, because there's several notes on it, and there's a real debate as to whose note, is the valid one.
Okay, now we've just seen a report coming out that house prices in 20 major cities in the U.S. are hitting new crisis lows. Housing market continues to deteriorate. This is the backdrop for the global financial crisis, as it's known, when broke onto the scene in the 2007 and 2008 period. You're saying that your role in government, going back to the Bush 1 administration and under the Reagan administration, when you were a part of the Housing Authority, is that when Jack Kemp was involved?
Yeah, he was the secretary.
Okay, and you were the undersecretary of Jack Kemp.
No, I was the FHA commissioner. I was the Assistant Secretary of Housing, FHA commissioner.
Okay, so during this period, all of the housing collapse and housing fraud and mortgage fraud was really birthed during that period when this housing market and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which were government agencies, quasi-government agencies at that time, really began this whole phenomenon of reselling the same mortgage multiple times to commit this massive funding fraud. Simultaneously, you've got this black funding of just outright theft by the intelligence agencies. Was there any crossover between the money stolen from the intelligence agencies and the accounting fraud in the housing authority during the Reagan period, Lynn Bush period?
Max, I believe so, because I believe crime that pays is crime that stays. If you look at how much money was taken out of the housing and other systems with the federal credit and the fraud in the 80s, I think that funded an infrastructure of people to come back and do it again, this time with derivatives and securitization that they didn't have in the 80s. So, you've literally been watching what I would call the privatization of government as people use federal credit and government assets to kind of shift wealth into private hands. So that's why I call it a financial coup d'etat. So, yeah, I think the seeds of the 80s built up. But remember, the way the system is run in the United States, you kind of you have a bubble, then you swing in a team to clean it up, then you have another bubble, then you swing in a team to clean it up. So you have your sort of cleanup team and then your bubble team. And the reality is to reaffirm, to have another bubble, you have to reaffirm the credibility of the federal mechanism, which is why you have a reform team and you look good and you clean it up, et cetera, et cetera. You kind of swing the pendulum back and forth. So I think that, I was part of a cleanup team, but one of the things I really want to stress to people that I saw in the Bush administration was a real sense that the world divides into two groups of people, one which is above the law and one which is not. I'll tell a story. I believe it's 1989, I was sitting in a meeting with Jack Kemp, who got very frustrated with one of the regional administrators. He was disagreeing with a decision he'd made, and the regional administrator said to him, but I had to do it. It was the law. And Jack turned to him and he said, I don't have to obey the law. I'm above the law. I report to a higher moral authority. So, you had this sense that a great deal of money had been stolen, and it had really empowered the people who stole it, who at that point believed that they were above the law.
All right, so we've got systemic law breaking in the United States government in these administrations, pretty well documented. You've got also extensive law breaking on Wall Street. That's also been pretty well documented. The rationalization, of course, is that the ends justify the means, that the U.S. is constantly under existential threat, and that the policymakers in Washington or the bankers on Wall Street have to break the law this one time to ensure security of the nation. In the meantime, America's competitiveness has collapsed. It's not even in the top 10 in terms of the most competitive countries in the world anymore. You've got social unrest now. The Occupy movements have gone coast to coast. The country is literally falling apart because...
No, but Max, I disagree with that. If you look both in technology and agriculture, you have several industries where America is clearly leading. So, I don't think that is completely true. And America is a land with enormous natural resources. I mean, the horrible thing about the story that you and I are talking about is, one of the most powerful forces in the world is everybody gets up every morning and goes back in and tries to make it work. And there's a new harvest. There's a new agricultural harvest every year, and there's plenty of harvest coming out of the land. So America creates enormous wealth. And what's been amazing is no matter how much you steal and harvest that, there's still more. So I don't think the American economy is necessarily gutted. Now, there's no doubt about it that we're globalizing manufacturing and we're globalizing labor, and we're shifting fundamentally the relationship between capital and labor in ways that can be very ugly. So I don't disagree with that. But the reality is, unfortunately, America still has many, many more rich resources that can be harvested.
Well, to follow up on that point, let's take a look at America's agricultural sector. Let's take a look at the corn industry, very heavily subsidized. And as a result, price of corn is artificially cheap. As a result of that, you've got high fructose corn syrup, which is artificially cheap, and it leads to an incredible obesity epidemic in America, where something like 60% of the people are obese due to the fact you've got subsidized corn and subsidized high-frequency corn syrup, which adds to the health costs in America. So it's an agricultural boom only to the extent that the government is willing to subsidize it. It can't compete on its own. American corn can't compete on its own. American agriculture, can it compete on its own without the subsidies? There's no proof to suggest that. I mean, America doesn't want to compete anymore. They just want to print money, and they want to go to war and kill people. There's nothing left there. It's an empty shell. You live in the country. How can you defend an economy that's producing such a ramshackle, an economic dead end that's producing social unrest and welfare from coast to coast?
Well, there's no doubt that, as you know, I don't agree with the leadership, and I certainly don't agree with the leadership of the agricultural community here. But I think my anger or my frustration and my distaste with both their values and their leadership is different than sort of looking at the resources itself. So the reality is, if tomorrow you could run American agriculture so that it could be healthy and it could feed healthy people and stop poisoning the population, if you look at the incredible resources of the land, what could happen would be fantastic.
Sure. But anyway, I want to move on back to the banking scandals. Let's talk about a financial terrorist like Angelo Mozilla, formerly of Countrywide. Now, he's got the state of California settled with Countrywide on his predatory lending practices. Again, now why do these mega corporations get to settle or agree to pay a fine without having to admit the fact that they committed an act of financial terrorism, that they broke the law? They just get a slap on the wrist. What's that all about? Is it because is there a need to create a hero out of a terrorist? I'm not sure. Is it part of the culture? Can you explain it?
What happened with the housing bubble starting in the mid-90s was the fraudulent inducement of America. A group of people were asked to go out and literally entrap America in extraordinary amounts of debt, whether it's fraudulent inducement or predatory lending. And Angelo Mozilla did a fabulous job at that. And if I'm right about the collateral fraud, he helped generate billions of dollars, including for the black budget. So he did what he asked. He did a great job at it. And the reality is, a system pays people well for doing what they're asked to do. So these guys were paid to fraudulently induce America, and that's what they did.
Well, yeah, Tony Soprano, I'm sure he's available to do a similar job. Now, Catherine Austin Fitts, if you were made Secretary of Housing today, you could introduce whatever policies you want without fear of any interference in any way, or as you directly experienced, you actually had death threats when you were working in the administration. What would your policies be to fix the housing market today? We've got about a minute and a half left.
Okay, well, first of all, it is impossible that I would ever work for the U.S. government again. So I just want to affirm that. So there is no way I will ever be Secretary of the Department of Housing and Urban and Development. But if I was, I would basically shut down the agency.
Okay, so it's a very short tenure in that job. Looking at the bigger picture, because now we have about a minute left, looking at the bigger picture, what economic policies could be enacted in the short term using the available tools in both Treasury, Fed, across the spectrum, that would reverse the current downturn?
What you need to do is you need to bring transparency to government investment by a place-based basis, and you need to hold pension fund and government investment to a model of investment which is both lawful and optimizes in the interests of whether it's the taxpayer or the beneficiaries. And you need to enforce the U.S. Constitution, including on the how government money is managed. You need to significantly reduce the food safety rules. You need to cancel the federal government's role in many functions. One thing you need to increase it in is by essentially publicizing the Federal Reserve and moving that back under the control of the Treasury. And finally, you need to unsuppress a great deal of technology in the energy and healthcare area, which could radically increase productivity and reduce costs. And then finally, you need to stop the two-tiered system of how you enforce capital controls so that small business and communities can freely circulate equity without having to go through Wall Street.
Well, it's a great list. I'd like to go through every single point one by one and enumerate and discuss it a bit, but we are out of time. So I have to thank you for being on the edge, and hopefully we'll have you back soon.
Thanks, Max. Have a wonderful day.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of On the Edge. I want to thank my guest, Catherine Austin Fitts. If you'd like to send me an email, please do so at ontheedge@presstv.com. Until next time, this is Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.